Okay, so principles and practices for navigating. Notice the next line there says addictions, trauma, and mental health challenges. The main point that I'm going to make today is that addictions, trauma, and mental health challenges are not three different things for most people, for 99% of all people. These are one thing. They're just different layers of the same thing. That's a really important, maybe the most important insight to get about addiction. Addiction is not about using. Alcoholism is not about drinking. It's about what the drinking lets you get away from. It's about what the using allows you to escape from, get a break from. It allows you a temporary respite from your suffering and your distress. So what's the distress? Something underneath. So in the addictions world, we tend to see it as part of a kind of a more complicated story. It's not just about people getting connected or hooked up or dependent on substances. That's a part of it. But that comes from somewhere. That has roots. And it's the roots that are important to address. So that's the focus that I'm going to bring to this. Okay, so, and I want to do that in four ways. One is what's normal for people, especially right now, especially during a time of turbulence, like during a pandemic. You know, during the pandemic, rates of drinking have gone up by something like 50% in Canada. And Canada is already a country where people drink too much. We're in that category of countries where people in my field, we look at that and we think that's probably not great. That's probably way too much. It's probably been normalized in a way that's not healthy. You know, binge drinking or daily drinking has been normalized. And I will talk about all these things, but we need to get a sort of baseline about what's normal for people in terms of their responses to especially stressful situations. What does that look like in terms of people's individual coping? What does health mean? Like, how do we approach something that might be called health in the world of recovery? And for some people, that's abstinence, and some people it's not. So we need to talk about that a little bit. Then, you know, skill too. Like how could we support ourselves? How could we think about supporting a loved one? How could we think about, you know, what could some simple things look like that we could do to help someone who's in distress in this way? So those are the four kind of overarching things. And I'm going to try to tackle them, you know, kind of more or less one at a time. But as I go through this, I think it's important to start with a little self-care reminder. These are tough topics for sure. You know, you're probably here because, like I said, you have a personal experience, either yourself or a loved one, a spouse, a child, a parent. So I'm going to go like pretty deeply into this stuff, and I'm going to probably say some things which make you think about your own life and the deep distress that you've experienced as a result of addiction. So, you know, you need to take care of yourself here. I can't really manage you, and I can't kind of observe. We're not in the space together that we're sharing. So I need to be able to sort of trust that you know how to take care of yourself here. If you have a strong emotional reaction to something I say or something you see on screen, you might not have that, and everybody's different. But if you do have a strong reaction, it's totally okay. It's totally normal. Happens all the time. It would be a bit unusual if it didn't happen. And if that's the case, do what you need to take care of yourself. So if you need to step away, do it. If you need to go, you know, take a break and have a cup of tea, do it. If you worry about doing that, if you worry about stepping away for a minute, that's okay, because you're going to get the recording, right? So you're not going to miss anything. Let's hope. So that last line on this slide here, learn and be safe, is my goal here. I want you to learn something useful about addiction. At the end of this, you're going to know more about addiction than 99% of people in the world. So that's great. And you need to be safe while doing that, emotionally safe. You can't really learn unless you're emotionally safe. So take care of yourself. Make sure you have at least one person in your life who you trust. That's an important tip that I'll probably say again. You know, there's a really, really high correlation here, a strong consistency here with recovery success, whatever success means for people in recovery. Everybody basically who succeeds in recovery does not do it alone. Everybody says that they find at least one person to trust, one safe person. That's super important. So make sure you have that person. And if you don't have that person, that should be a goal. Whether you are struggling with addiction or not, having safe people in your life is probably the most important thing you can do for your mental health. Okay, So I'm going to kind of look at, explore, try to explain the 4 layers that go into this world of addiction. There's the resonance layer, which is the deepest layer, the layer of family and early childhood and culture and the world, history, gender, all these kind of things we don't really control. And then there's our personal response to all that stuff, the things that happened to us that cause us to go into distress. And then there's how we adapt to those things in the long run. And then addiction is the top layer, the one that is a response to the previous 3. So I'll tackle each one of these, right? So resonance layer is the deepest one. And then on top of that, we have the response layer, which is really about trauma. We talk a lot about trauma these days, and there's a good reason for that. I think that in the world of psychotherapy and counseling, so much of the conversation in the last 20 years has been about the fact that trauma seems to be at the root of almost everything. Not absolutely everything, but so much of what people struggle with is rooted in some way or deeply connected or deeply interwoven with trauma. And so much of psychotherapy has shifted toward this lens of thinking about trauma as a kind of foundational piece. And for people with addiction, it is almost always a foundational piece. Something happened, or a series of somethings happened that kind of nudged people in a certain direction. So I'll talk about that a little bit. You'll see those 4 responses there: flight, freeze, orient, and fight. You'll recognize at least a couple of those, like the fight or flight response. But this is kind of the crucible. This is the kind of the way in which we start to get stuck and we simmer in these really deep evolutionary nervous system responses. I'll say more about that in a minute. And then on top of that, we have the mental health reactions, right? We tend to think of depression and anxiety and these kind of mental health challenges as being somehow of uncertain origin. They just kind of happen to people. They might be connected to neurology and to biochemistry and genetics. And we have all these ideas about where they come from. And some of those things are true and interconnected, but these are largely, for most people, adaptations to experience. Things have happened to them that have nudged them in this direction. Over time, with stuff like depression and anxiety, over a long period of time, multiple things have happened or did not happen. In the case of kids and parenting, which I'll say more about. So when we look at these 3 layers, right, there's this really deep backstory that all of us carry about our history, our gender, our family, our culture, these stories we've inherited without asking for them. And we carry them. And they exert a tremendous influence on us in ways that we often don't recognize. We see this with addiction to alcohol in particular. Your biggest risk by far of being an alcoholic is not your exposure to alcohol. It's, did you have an alcoholic parent? And that's not because there's a gene for alcoholism. There isn't. It's because the patterns of behavior in alcoholic families teach people to be certain ways. It teaches people to not be safe to talk about feelings, for example. If you are a child growing up in an alcoholic home, there's a period of the day where it's relatively safe. And then usually at night, it becomes really unsafe. And bad things happen. And then in the morning, everybody's supposed to pretend that everything's fine. And you kind of reset. You're not allowed to talk about what happened. You're supposed to pretend that, okay, just ignore that stuff. We move forward today into a new day. And everything's fine. And above all, don't tell anybody outside the family this is going on. As a kid, this is really crazy making. And you learn these kind of habits of behavior. You get really anxious about sharing feelings, and you get kind of secretive and furtive about emotions. You learn to deny emotions. You learn to not speak up. All these behaviors that you learn as a kid just come to you because you're growing up in this kind of a family. And then when you become an adolescent, you're trying to navigate that really difficult emotional period. One of the things that can help you do it is if you drink. You feel normal, natural, you feel okay. Many people I know who are or were alcoholics say that, taking the first drink when they were a teenager was the first time they ever felt okay. They ever felt like themselves. They ever felt like they could be who they are, right? So that's just one example of how this kind of deep story from the family influences in ways we often don't recognize. And then the response layer, this trauma layer. Things happen to people. Most people have trauma. Trauma is this kind of, moment where the body just takes over. The body decides that you're in a situation of life-threatening risk, whether you are or you aren't. And it takes over, and it does one of these reactions. You know, you kind of dissociate, or you freeze, or you get super anxious and you get hypervigilant and you orient around. I'll say more about that in a minute. Or you get angry and you fight back. And this ancient evolutionary nervous system thing is designed to help us evade, you know, saber-toothed tigers, which most of us don't do anymore. But now we're evading, you know, meetings at work, and we're evading difficult colleagues, and we're evading traffic, right? So these are all stressors, and the body doesn't care, you know, what the type of stressor is. Once the stress gets to a certain point, then the body just takes over. So much of addiction, so much of the struggle around addiction is about these locked trauma responses that people have. And if those responses go on long enough, then you end up in the world of, you know, dissociation, depression, anxiety, and anger. They match up to the 4 nervous system responses in the previous column. And if all this stuff goes on long enough, goes on for years, you know, then of course, yeah, you end up in this world of addiction. And the addictions, in a way, are methods to allow especially the locked response patterns in the nervous system, especially these responses to trauma. Addiction is a way to allow the responses to keep going. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But here's the basic template, right? Addiction is not about using. It's about the stuff in the first 3 columns. The using itself creates its own problems, for sure, like dependency and wrecking your relationships and wrecking your finances and wrecking your career and wrecking your whole life. And those are definitely important, but they don't sort of start and end there. They're not about really the using part. They're about all the other stuff that's led to the using. Okay, so the key here is that we always bring this context, this unresolved family childhood stuff that we really should think about and address to the extent that we can. And we always bring our personal traumas too, because in addition to the stuff that happened in our families, we have stuff that happened just to us personally, you know, illnesses, car accidents, you know, situations in relationships that were traumatic, whatever it is, right? We have stuff. And if those things are significant enough that they kind of derail us, they derail our ability to manage our lives and feel okay, then at a certain point, you know, we're going to develop some kind of mental health adaptation. We're going to develop some sort of coping mechanism. The psychiatric model views these things as disorders, and we're used to that kind of language, but really it's a kind of order. These are ways, mental health challenges are ways for the body to try to navigate through impossibly stressful situations. Mental health challenges are a search for healing. You know, the mental health challenge of depression is like, can I just escape and kind of curl inward? The mental health challenge of anxiety is can I get ahead of it? Can I stay out front of it? Can I escape it? Can I run away from it, right? And the mental health challenge of anger is, you know, can I fight back in a situation where I feel powerless? So a lot of these things are really deep nervous system reactions. And on top of it, the top layer, almost always, is addiction. And it's almost always just the top layer, right? As I've said a couple of times already, and I'll probably say again. Okay, so it's really important to understand this dynamic here before we dive deeper, because people tend to think of addiction as sort of this thing that exists in isolation. People often get confused about where it comes from. How did a certain person become addicted? And the answer to that is usually actually somewhat simpler, but also more complicated than you realize. It's simpler in the sense that it's usually about underlying stuff. But it's more complex because that underlying stuff weaves together 3 different layers. Are the layer of stuff that's happened to us, the layer of our adaptations, our behavioral adaptations to the stuff that's happened to us, and the layer of stuff we carry from our families and our cultures and our genders and from the world, you know, that we don't necessarily control, like climate change. Like we don't control climate change, right? Individually, we can do our part, of course, to ameliorate climate change, but we don't control it. And so many people feel powerless in the face of climate change. Many young people have tremendous anxiety around climate change. Many people just in general have anxiety around climate change. And so that's a stressor. That's an ongoing stressor. And so it's not the kind of thing where you can just say, I'm not going to be impacted by it. So a lot of the addictive behaviors that we see, a lot of the mental health behaviors are all connected into this other stuff that's around us. Okay, so risks. broadly speaking, what are the risks that you should be thinking about in terms of yourself for addictions and this whole landscape of addiction, mental health, trauma? The first thing is parental stuff. What's happened in your family? Look, your family, like mine, is kind of cracked and kind of broken, right? That's the deal. That's family. That's all families. There's trauma and mental illness and addiction in all families. And you for sure have a loved one, or a sibling, a child, a parent, yourself, who is struggling with something really deep and really persistent. You know, more than 50% of Canadians will have experienced mental illness by age 40, right? So that's like more than half the population right there. On any given day, you know, something like 25% of Canadians are struggling with depression, and another 25 are struggling with anxiety. Among young people, that's much higher. Among university students, it's like 80%. So you'll see different numbers depending on how you look at this, but these struggles are pretty typical, pretty normal, and often they're in the background of our lives, and we don't pay attention to them as much as we maybe should. So if you have a parent, if you have or had a parent with a mental illness and or an addiction, if you had some early childhood stress or trauma, stuff that happened in your family life, you know, violence in the home, neglect, poverty, illness, these kinds of things. If you have a family where you never talked about feelings, or talking about feelings was not okay or not safe, then this kind of deep avoidance of facing stuff is often the legacy of that. If you had a vulnerable adolescence, I mean, adolescence is vulnerable to begin with. And a good chunk of the work that I do is with parents and schools and family groups where, how do we navigate this really delicate time of adolescence for kids, especially between 9 and 15. But if you had this kind of adolescence where there's lots of unsafe risk, that's a kind of good marker, that one. There's this complicated thing about childhood development, brain development, neurology, and risk-taking that I'm not going to get into today. But risky behavior is the signal of it. Adolescent risky behavior that's beyond the norm for risky, usually indicates something going on beneath the surface there. If you didn't have mentors as an adolescent, if you didn't have a safe grandparent or a safe teacher or a safe coach, kids need that. It's absolutely crucial for their personal development that they get good mentorship between, especially 9 to 15, but also between 15 and 28. Years of age. So if you didn't get that, then that's often a really important signal about what might become a kind of drifty existence. Or if you had negative mentorship, right? Gang life is negative mentorship. Jackassery culture of kids is negative mentorship. Kids don't have, in my field, people use the term self-regulation, the ability to manage your emotions. And to notice what you're feeling, to say, wow, I'm feeling this certain thing, and to express it and to manage it appropriately with other people around you. Kids can't have that until they're about 28. The development of the nervous system doesn't allow that to complete until about age 28. Hopefully they get better from about 9 onward. They get better at it. But that requires a certain kind of structure from family life and from school life and from community life in order for that to work. So a lot of people end up in these situations where they don't have good mentors, and that can be a sidelining kind of experience. The last 3 are about sort of adulthood, right? Adulthood environments have normalized addiction, like living in Canada. So we normalize alcohol addiction in Canada and cannabis addiction. So we would say that if you have a drink after work every day, that's totally normal, and we might even say it's healthy. And you probably know that there's no level of alcohol that's healthy. 0 level of alcohol is healthy for you, but we normalize daily drinking. We make it a kind of Epicurean thing. You say, well, if you drink every day, you enjoy wine, or you enjoy relaxing after the day, or whatever it is, or it becomes a communal thing around dinner. Okay, but for most people, the function of that daily drink is to provide a level of self-regulation that they can't do themselves, because the day stresses you out, and then you get home and then you need something to de-stress. And so you drink. So that's the actual definition of addiction that people in my field use. It's not about the amount that you use. It's about the function of the using. And the most useful definition of addiction is that it's substitute self-regulation. It gets you to it impacts your nervous system in a way that leads you to where you want to go, but you can't really do it yourself. You need the substance to help you do it. And so a lot of daily drinkers are in this situation where the daily drinking, they don't think it's a risk, but it's actually a huge risk. Daily drinking kind of tends to accelerate over time. You drink a little bit more because your tolerance goes up. When you ask daily drinkers, how much do you drink? Most of the answer that you get is most of the time it's, 50% or so of what they actually do drink. So people underestimate their daily drinking also. And of course, if you drink every day, it's a huge health risk, just in terms of longevity and overall health. So we kind of normalize addiction. We also normalize binge drinking on the weekend in Canada. We normalize this thing of people kind of storing up their stress throughout the week and then kind of cutting loose on the weekend and getting really drunk on a Friday or Saturday night or both. And we don't think much of that. We don't say that's probably not great. We sort of support it in many ways. And we have cultures of people who just do this as a normal thing. And it's not normal and it's not healthy. It's again, substitute self-regulation. The level of stress there is so high that the person can't manage it. And so they need this weekend release via substance use to get to the place where they feel okay. And then Monday comes and they just start to kind of do it again and build up the stress throughout the week again. So a lot of normalized addictive behavior is happening in Canada. Cannabis would be the other one that's been quite normalized, and I'll say more about that in a bit. Also, a big risk for people often is building a life of relationships around yourself where the focus is on not facing things. It's possible to have a collegial environment and a friendship environment and a home life where you just don't talk about stuff and you don't want to open the can of worms. Well, the reality there is that unless you open the can of worms, at least in yourself with a safe person, you're not going to get anywhere in terms of your personal growth. So these are all kind of parts of what happens, how we build lives around ourselves, lives of avoidance often for many people. And then the last risk is being in the creative professions. You folks are in the creative professions. There's a significantly higher risk of addictive behavior and also mental illness in the creative professions. Studies have been done about this. Now, the question becomes, well, does being in the creative professions make you like that? Or are people who are already like that, do they go into the creative professions? And I think the answer is more the second one. People who are already struggling with mental health issues and who might also have addictive tendencies, they often gravitate to the creative professions, which tend to be more fluid and flexible in many ways and accommodate a greater degree of behavioral diversity. And so that's how that goes. But being in the creative professions comes with this problem that people normalize unhealthy behavior. Writers, I'm a writer, and so I know in the writing community there's a kind of extolling of the addictive alcoholic writer, right? Even now, even after all that we know about this, there's still an extolling of that. So take people drinking to loosen the creative juices, as they say, stuff like that, right? So all this stuff gets normalized, and we should really question that. Okay, so those are your risks. You probably see yourself on one of these lines at least, right? You might see, for me, if I look at this, like I have all these risks, every single one of them, right? And some of you on the call will also. That's not super unusual, right? Okay, so let me talk about trauma for 5 minutes. So, I already talked about these stress responses, right? These 4 things that happen. And because trauma is so much at the root of addiction, so much of the time, we should spend a little bit of time here just kind of explaining in more detail what I mean by this and how it works. So I'll go through each one of these in turn. There are 4 different stress responses when the body takes over. There's the stress response where you just kind of zone out and you just try to get elsewhere in your mind, in your imagination. You withdraw, you retreat, you leave the stage, you just go elsewhere, right? It's not a conscious choice for people to do this or any of these responses that I'm going to show, but they're all the same in the sense that the body takes over. Which one of these responses you do is a matter of your childhood development, what your family was like, what you were like as a person, what your experiences have been, a whole complicated set of things predispose you to certain kinds of responses. And that predisposes you to certain kinds of mental illness, and that predisposes you to certain kinds of addiction. But the root really is here in the nervous system responses. You, me, and everybody else, we have one favorite response that we do whenever we get stressed. And it's instinctive and automatic. Think about it. Think about yourself. When you get stressed out, you always do the same thing. You either retreat and dissociate and zone out, or you freeze. I'll go through these. Or you freeze, or you get anxious, or you get angry. And you do the same thing every time. And you've been doing the same thing since you were a kid. But you learned how to do that same thing somewhere, typically in your family, in your early development, because of things that happened to you. So you have a habit, and everybody does. And the nervous system is very tuned to that habit. And the nervous system will always do the same thing when you get stressed out, right? So the nervous system might cause you to become kind of spacey and dissociated, or it might cause you just to shut down. I feel nothing. I feel numb. Nothing's going on for me. I'm really tired. I just want to go home and sleep. If you're the kind of person who wants to sleep 12 hours a day when you get stressed out, if you want to, binge watch every episode of Doctor Who. I had a student who did that. It's like 40 weeks of your life, 24 hours a day to watch all of Doctor Who, going back to 1967 or whatever. So the binge watching, binge sleeping, binge eating, all these kinds of things. There's this really deep, I'm not leaving the planet like the flight response folks. I'm just freezing down. I'm just getting really quiet and really slow and kind of turning inward to kind of keep myself safe. Or you might do the opposite of that. You might become hypervigilant. You might get really anxious. You might try to go really fast. The nervous system in that situation is like, if you can stay ahead of your problems, you'll be okay. If you just ignore them, and if you just pretend everything's fine, and you just have a million to-do lists, and you try to tick off stuff on your to-do list endlessly, you'll be fine. And these are the folks who have, endless hobbies, endless to-do lists, endless unfinished projects around their house, endless careers that they started but didn't finish, a transcript, an educational transcript that has like 10,000 subjects on it but no degrees, that kind of thing, right? So this is this kind of fragmenting of consciousness. It's this kind of speediness that happens, where you just kind of move your attention from one thing to another, to another, to another, to another. Because if you keep your attention on one thing long enough, you'll have to slow down. And if you slow down, the thing that's chasing you, the emotion that's chasing you, will catch up. And that's bad. So don't do that. So just flip to another thing, to another thing, to another thing. People do this in relationships, the 2-month relationship pattern, right? Same kind of thing. Or you might get angry. You might fight back. When I talk about alcohol in a minute, a bit more, when we think about alcoholism, there's a kind of pervasive powerlessness that alcoholics feel. They feel like the world is out of control. They don't control enough in their own lives. They feel powerless over many things, and that makes them angry, and they want to control it. So they reach out to control it. And so there's this kind of control and return that happens. People want to return. People who have the fight response, they always want to roll back the clock. They always want to go back to when things were better. They want to go into the past. They want to recapture lost glory or whatever it is, right? So they become very good at enduring and kind of keeping that fire of anger rolling along. Sometimes this expresses itself as violence, or sometimes it's, verbal abuse of other people around them. The typical angry alcoholic would fit in this category. Okay, so these are the 4 responses. Think about where you get stuck here. Take a moment of self-reflection. I'm not going to ask you to share this, but think about yourself for a second, or a loved one who might be struggling. Which one of these responses are they stuck in? Why are they stuck? Or if you're thinking about yourself, why am I stuck? What happened to me so that I ended up getting stuck here? What's the nervous system response? The important thing to remember about the nervous system response of trauma is that it's not voluntary. It's automatic. The nervous system, something way beyond your conscious control, something with 6 million years of evolutionary success behind it, says, hey, I'll take over now and I'll do this thing so that you're safe. So a lot of people struggling with traumatic fallout, things like mental health challenges or addictions, they're very judgy about themselves. Other people judge them too, but there's a lot of shame and guilt around addiction. Like somehow it's a character failing. But for the vast majority of people, well, for everybody, it's not a character failing, but for the vast majority of people, their addiction is actually about this. It's actually about locked response patterns that are in the nervous system that are locked and they can't unlock. They're stuck there. And because it's beyond conscious control, you can't fix it. You can't fix it with willpower. You can't fix it by just saying, I'm not going to drink today, right? The vast majority of people just are not successful if they have an addiction and they just try to use willpower to stop. I will talk about what they should use later after the break, but locked response patterns are really deep in the system. You can't voluntarily stop them. They are way more powerful than your thinking mind. That's an important thing to remember when dealing with people who are struggling. They're not doing this just to piss you off. They're doing this because they're locked in and they can't get out. Okay, the locking is important. Now, if the locking goes on long enough, you end up in the world of mental health challenges, as I already explained a bit ago. So I'll run through these. Now, these are the behavioral coping behaviors that end up living on top of the locked response patterns of trauma. So there's 4 of them, and they line up with the previous ones completely, like right on top. So if you are trying to get elsewhere and you're in this kind of dissociation response, you just zoned out because you're too stressed out and you're trying to get away, you're trying to retreat. This is the kind of thing you might retreat into. Fantasy and kind of, spirituality. There's a positive spirituality, of course, but there's also a negative spirituality, as with all things human. And the negative spirituality is using your spirituality to escape from the world, to go, in your mind or in your prayers to some place where divine beings are nice and people won't hurt you, things like that. So there's a kind of escape that happens here, escape from the world. Binge Netflix watching can be part of that too, right? Binge TV, binge anything, right? Where you're just trying to craft a world that is better in your mind than the world you're actually living in. It's very effective in the sense that you get to live in that world. It doesn't help you pay the rent or build relationships or get better though, right? It's a locked response pattern. You can also, find that in dreams and storytelling in the world of the imagination. A lot of artists do that, right? A lot of artists have this kind of, a dissociation response. And then if you've had a series of traumatic situations or a legacy of trauma from your family where your impulse, the nervous system's impulse is to freeze, then depression is one of the things that can result there. This kind of slowing down and this collapse, the idea of just kind of, I can't face the world and it's all too much. And I just got to pull the covers over and keep myself safe for a while, right? Erase myself and go home. During the pandemic, a lot of people have just gone home, and some of that's required, but a lot of people are just like, I don't want to face the world right now. The world feels overwhelming and it's like a wave crashing. And your response to that can be to try to make yourself as small as possible. Or if your trauma response, your nervous system response to stress is to get anxious, to get hypervigilant and orienting, then you end up in this world of anxiety where you obsessively clean, you obsessively make to-do lists, you obsessively do stuff. OCD is, I don't like, as I mentioned a while ago, I don't like the psychiatric language. There's a whole side conversation we could have about the fact that the psychiatric model totally doesn't work. And everybody recognizes this. Everybody in my field recognizes this, but it just keeps going because of legacy reasons mostly. But the whole idea of disorders, the whole idea that there's kind of these things that are can be labeled in these kind of ways is really controversial and not super helpful and not supported by research either. But it goes on. So OCD would be this kind of anxiety level stuff where you just can't stop. You just can't stop these behaviors that are impulsive and instinctive, and they help you feel better because they burn off some of that emotional energy, but they don't really get you to a healing place, to a place of wellness. They just keep you moving forward really fast. Or fight response leads to, of course, anger, aggression. And, I explained that a bit before, the idea to control in a situation where you feel powerless. So for most people who end up in the world of addiction, they end up here on this slide first. They end up with these mental health challenges first. And they end up with the mental health challenges because of something that's happened before, usually trauma. Not always, but usually. So they end up with this kind of mental health situation that is really, really hard to deal with. If you end up with this mental health situation as an adolescent, if you're retreating from the world and you have no peers and you feel completely alone, or if you're depressed and completely exhausted and tired all the time and feel overwhelmed by everything you face, or if you're super anxious and you can't stop all these kind of adaptive, obsessive behaviors to manage yourself, and it just, you can't sleep, you can't eat, you're just anxious all the time, or if you're just angry, if you're that kind of angry young person who's angry at everything all the time, typically because parents did bad shit to you, right? Typically, not always, but almost always in that case. Then you have a mental health challenge. Notice that I use the term mental health challenge and not the word mental illness, not the term mental illness. It's not illness. An illness is something wrong in the body. This is different. This is an adaptation. This is the body's way of trying to keep you safe. It's not an illness. It's an adaptation to circumstances. It's the body's way of saying, hey, this is too much for you. I'll take over. I'll take over and try to get you there. And it doesn't work. I mean, the body's designed for, saber-tooth tigers. In which situation the risk lasts 10 seconds and then is over, right? So this is not the world we live in. The world we live in has these ongoing stressors. So we get stuck. We get stuck again and again and again, being stressed out by stuff. And the body takes over again and again and again and again and again. The body gets used to taking over again and again and again and again. Goes on for years, and then we wake up one morning and we realize we've been depressed for a decade, and how the hell did I get here? Well, the body took you there because the body's trying to keep you safe. Something is not working and you haven't been able to figure it out, and the body says, okay, while you're trying to figure it out, I'll keep you safe. I'll get you out of these situations. It's effective. It feels terrible, of course. Any of these things feel terrible when you're going through them, but it's effective. The body doesn't care about whether or not you feel good or you support or you endorse the body's reactions. The body just does its thing. Okay, now, last level, top level is addiction. And of course, they line up exactly to the previous layers. There's addictions around escaping, addictions around collapsing, addictions around containing all that emotional energy, and addictions of control. Well, that's alcohol, of course, right? So briefly, each one of those. Each one of these columns on this slide has a substance after the title, so hallucinogens in this case. It has like another kind of addiction on the second line, like fantasy gaming here. It has yet another kind of addiction on the third line, and often like yet another way this can go. So this is not intended to be an exhaustive list of all addictions, but this is how it typically looks. Often addiction has a substance, like, hallucinogens tend to facilitate escape from the world. Often there's also another kind of addiction that is not a substance, like, gambling or eating or whatever, that we can identify in ourselves or other people. So it's not just substance use, it's also behavioral, what we would call behavioral addictions as well. And these days, tech addiction too is part of that, right? So if your nervous system is locked into a particular response pattern, in this case, the pattern of dissociation, because that's what your nervous system has decided it wants to do, it needs to do to keep you safe, and you end up in that world where you have a mental health challenge around dissociation and escape from the world, one of the ways you can facilitate and continue that escape from the world is by using hallucinogens. So you see in this first column the basic pattern that will prevail across the other three columns to come in a minute. The substance or the addictive behavior facilitates the continuation of the locked response pattern. That's how this all works. So take a second example. If you're in the freeze response and you're struggling with depression, you're probably, if you're going to pick up an addiction, right, it's not going to be hallucinogens. It's going to be opioids, maybe cannabis, or maybe it's binge eating and binge watching, right? Or binge sleeping, addiction to sleeping, right? So the type of substance people find is not random. The type of substance people find is the substance that allows the continuation of the locked response pattern. Same pattern prevails with stimulants, right? Stimulants, they keep going indefinitely. Stay up, don't sleep, don't face stuff, keep ahead of it, keep running, right? Intensity, anything to do with intensity. For many years, I was involved pretty deeply in the rock climbing community. And there's just so many people in the rock climbing community who use climbing to manage anxiety. It's a super intense experience where you have to face your anxiety all the time. And many people with anxiety issues choose climbing because of that. It allows you to stay ahead of it. It allows you to kind of stay stimulated and moving forward, right? Or, alcohol again, right? Control, aggression, anger, fight, response. So these addictions are the end of the train, not the beginning. They're the result of a bunch of other things that have happened before, not the cause of something. So when we think about addiction, we should not think, man, where did this come from? It came from nowhere. No, it came from somewhere. Where did it come from? That requires us to face it, to face up to the things that have happened to us that have harmed us. That is very difficult to do in families. Most of the time when I'm working with families, there's at least a couple of people who say, we're a super loving family. We never did anything to hurt our child. And the child has a really long-term, really troubling addiction. Well, that doesn't square, right? Something is happening here. Something is happening here. It doesn't mean the parents are abusive, but it means there's a secret, there's something that's happening that hasn't been talked about, hasn't been worked through. There's some disconnect there that's been harmful for everybody. So when we think about this, the last thing I want to give you before our break is this thing here, which is about how we could think about this, right? Are there learned avoidance behaviors that we have in our families if we're parents with our kids, or with our own parents if we're adults? Do we have learned avoidance behaviors that have prevented us from dealing with stuff we should deal with? Often in families, there is a lot of such stuff. Do we have unresolved trauma responses? Did something happen to us that we didn't deal with? Or something happened to our family that we didn't deal with? We just pretended it would all go away. Do we have mental illness, right? Are there persistent mental health challenges that we're dealing with that we haven't dealt with? Or that we just say, oh, it's just biochemistry. It's not just biochemistry. That's part of it, for sure. But it's not just biochemistry. It's more complicated than that. It has to do with our deep back story. And then, do we have addictions, right? Do we have addictions either on our own lives or on the lives of our loved ones? And if so, how could we have a more nuanced view of what that means? So in a minute, we're going to have a break, and I'm going to encourage you to think about this, and maybe also to think about, if you're a parent, are there stuff that you might want to, are there things that you might want to deal with in that world, since addiction is just the biggest family problem, right? And every family has the addiction problem somewhere in it. And it's usually about one of these four things, right? So I'm going to encourage you to think about that during the break, and maybe make some notes about it if that's useful for you, because we're not going to talk about it. It's a private thing. It's just for you personally. I want to tag it here. Are there maybe things that should be addressed that haven't been addressed? As we go through this next part, I want you to think about risks again a little bit, and some of the example dynamics that we see in the world of addiction that are really common. A legacy of family drinking. So alcohol first. A legacy of family drinking, daily stress drinking that I talked about, pandemic drinking that I talked about, weekend binge drinking, also talked about. All of these kinds of things have a substitute self-regulation problem. They're definitely likely to create these locked response patterns in people. Also, drinking alcohol over the long term causes a kind of cognitive impairment for most people. Well, for everybody. So these things are often in play, right? You have a family background of drinking where there's a normalization of unhealthy drinking. There's some kind of cognitive impairment for the parent or parents who drink. And you grow up in that environment, which is a weird, stressful environment, super traumatic for kids. And then you have to figure out as an adolescent how to navigate that. And you will probably pick drinking again, like your parents, because it's the thing that facilitates you coming out of your shell, which is the thing that the family environment doesn't allow you to do. So stuff like alcohol, it's usually pretty straightforward to track it back. And for most people with alcoholism, we're talking about family dynamics here that are really old. And we're talking about current stressors that they just need to bring down, or they can't bring down, and so they drink. And drinking alcohol is kind of effective at bringing the momentary stress down, that artificial self-regulation where you just feel like, you can take a breath. So it's effective in that way in the short run, but of course, over time, it wrecks your life. Now, alcohol is just one substance, right? It's just ethanol. It's just one chemical. But cannabis is over 150 different kinds of chemicals. It's way more complicated. So we see more complicated dynamics there. And there's 4 or 5 things there to be on the lookout for. One is many people are using cannabis for managing underlying mental illness, for sure, especially depression and anxiety. Daily coping behaviors like using cannabis every day to relax or using cannabis every day to sleep. Typically, we see that kind of taking off in this age of vulnerable adolescence where the nervous system is trying to figure itself out. And alcohol is the same way, between around age 12, people start usually, but cannabis, people start around age 12 and they get in the habit of using this substance in a daily way to manage adolescence is a very stressful time, right? It's the most stressful period of human life, actually, according to research. So if they get in this kind of habit of using cannabis to manage the underlying stress, instead of resolving it in other healthier ways, they can get into this world of daily cannabis use, which is now legal. And so, there's a lot of rationale that people say, well, it's legal, it's safe, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that cannabis, just like alcohol causes this cognitive impairment, cannabis comes with its own kind of neurological impairment and it has 2 faces. The first thing is that cannabis impairs motivation. And so over time, habitual users, they tend to kind of get more drifty and they go slower and they get less connected in, they get less stressed out. But part of how we move forward in life and learn and grow and develop things, develop relationships and careers and all that is because of the stimulation of the stress of it, right? We need stress. We need a certain amount of healthy stress in order to live healthy lives. And so you can get in this thing where you just don't ever want to experience stress, and cannabis can help you get there. And so there's this kind of impairment in motivation. But the other really pernicious thing about regular ongoing cannabis use, and again, it's not so much about how much or how often, it's about this kind of habitual use. The other thing is that the part of ourselves that would normally notice things like impairment and motivation, the self-reflective component, the part of ourselves that is able to say, look at ourselves and say, hey, I can see myself. Like right now, I can sort of look inside myself and I can ask myself, how am I feeling? What's going on for me? How am I feeling here? And what is my emotions? What's my inner landscape, right? And I can get a good read on it right now. The impairment from cannabis is you lose that ability. So people have this impairment in motivation, but they also have this impairment in the ability to notice the impairment in motivation. This is a big problem. So cannabis users never notice their own impairment. And that's why, if you are the kind of person who lives or knows or loves a cannabis user, regular cannabis user, and if you've tried to talk to that person about it, your experience, I'm pretty much sure, is that they just were like, it's not a problem. You're the one with the problem. It's fine. Cannabis users are legendary for this. They just don't see it. And it's not denial. It's impairment. It's the impairment that comes with habitual use. They've been damaged, but they don't see the damage because part of the damage is that it damages the part of you that would see the damage. It's a really, really tricky situation. It's hard to break out of that one because people need self-awareness to get out of addiction. And getting to that place of self-awareness is a long road for people with cannabis addiction. Okay, this might be you. It might be someone you love. And so the next bit of this is, okay, here are we've talked about the dynamics, talked about the risks, we talked about specific examples of this. How do we move forward? Okay. There are 4 things. Just like there are, 4 layers, and then there was 4 trauma responses, and there was 4 behavioral adaptations to trauma, and there was 4 kinds of addiction. There's 4 essential experiences. And these things line up, just like all the other ones line up. Belonging, trust, safety, and empowerment. Belonging is finding your people. Trust is trusting one person. Safety is being able to be who you are and share it. And empowerment is being able to take the first 3 things and do something with them. Being able to take a sense of belonging and trust and emotional safety and do something in the world with those things. These 4 things line up with the first 4 ages of childhood development, and there's a whole other side conversation to be had about that. These are really early, really old, in the sense that they're really early childhood things for us. They are the basics. They are the basic building blocks required for healthy life. If you don't have these things, you really cannot build a healthy life for yourself. And if you're in addiction, if you don't have some of these things, most of them, a little bit of all of them, you can't heal. You can't. You need these things. So the reason you need them is that these are the things that unlock locked nervous system response patterns, because the nervous system, remember, is trying to keep you safe from stress. When you feel like you belong and you feel like you've come home, the nervous system is like, oh, that's a safe place. When you trust another person and you have a sense of connection and intimacy, the nervous system says, oh, that's safe. When you feel emotionally safe to be who you are in the world, the nervous system says, oh, that's good, safe. And when you feel empowered, you feel like you can do stuff with your life, the nervous system feels, hey, you don't have to fight so hard. You can do what you want, right? So just like the nervous system response patterns are these deep evolutionary imprints that have been with humans ever since the beginning, these imprints, these healthy imprints, are also the same. They balance out the nervous system response patterns. So they're absolutely essential. You can't really get anywhere without these things. People who feel like they don't belong never get there. People who don't ever trust never get there. People who never feel safe never get there. And of course, people who feel powerless never get there. So this is what we should focus on. How do we build these things, right? How do we build a sense of belonging for people? So that's programs or communities or workplaces or families, right? This is your place. You belong here. You're one of us. I'm happy you're here. I'm happy you came. We need to set some boundaries around stuff like safe behavior. If somebody's in a family, it often happens that a child will steal money from the family or will, live at home and do drugs at home. And the parents are like, we don't like that. That's totally fine to not like that. And to set a boundary that says, no, you can't do that. You can live here. You can be with us. We want you to be here. And you don't get to use drugs in your bedroom, and you don't get to deal drugs from the front porch, right? So those kinds of boundary setting behaviors, they really make a place of belonging safe. You can't have a place of belonging that has no boundaries. A lot of parents struggle with this with their kids. They have trouble setting boundaries. Little kids and adolescents, especially, they need really strong boundaries in the family system. Really strong rules, really strong enforcement, consistent enforcement of rules that are fair, that are just, and that are wise. And for parents, this is an endless struggle, an endless ongoing 10,000 conversations struggle about how we make this work so the kids feel a place of belonging and a place of empowerment. Many people who live in the world of addiction, they have this family story where they felt like they never belonged. If you look at the statistics around who has an addiction and what's their childhood backstory. The people who have the most likelihood, I think the most of all likelihood of ending up in the world of addiction, all other things considered, are adoptees, right? People who often struggle with feeling they belong, right? So belonging is super important. And then on top of that sense of belonging, how can we find people to trust if we're struggling? So this kind of language, right? How can I help you? How can we help you? What can we do? What do you need? Here's what we need. We need you to not be dealing drugs at home. What do you need, right? Meet me halfway. Trust is about meeting people halfway. Trust is not about you getting to do what you want and the other person getting to do what they want. Trust is about meeting each other halfway. This is what I need. This is what you need. Let us meet in the middle somehow and make this work. Trust is fragile. It can easily be broken. In the world of addiction, it gets broken all the time. How do I learn to trust a person who has broken my trust a million times? It's hard. It's hard to rebuild that. In the case of parents and kids, it takes years, many, many years. So we shouldn't kind of undersell this. We shouldn't say, oh, it's just, just trust us. No, you have to work on trust. That halfway point where we can meet one another in the middle. You get what you need and I get what I need together, probably with some negotiation and compromise. How can we help people feel safe? Explore, be yourself, right? So many people I know in addiction ended up there mostly because they grew up and discovered themselves to be a certain kind of person. And their parents and families said, it's not okay to be that kind of a person. And that's the source of the whole thing right there. So many people I know are like that, right? You have to be able to explore and be yourself. You have to be able to express all of who you are in the world in order to be healthy. And other people need to do the same thing. And you need to find the limits of how you can make that work in a relationship, right? But a sense of safety. It is okay to be who you are. Should be a message from parents to kids every day. So finding the safety, again, is not easy. It's complicated. And with parents and kids especially, and I'm talking about parents and kids a lot here because these are not only the childhood things, but this is where the root of most addiction lies, in the early family. One or more of these things was not there. You did not feel like you belonged, or you could not trust your parents to be safe people, or you never felt safe being yourself. Those kinds of things, right? That's where it goes back to for most people. And then empowerment's kind of built on top of that, standing in, having hard conversations. This is one that I see a lot with families. I work with families and parents a lot. I do these kinds of sessions for parent groups. And, I often find that having hard conversations is really hard in families. Like, parents have a mental illness or an addiction, and so does their child. And the parent is okay to talk about the child's addiction, but not their own, right? That's the most common one. Or the child feels like they don't belong. And the parent says, you belong, but only if you do everything the way that I want you to do it, right? So there's all these ways in which people really struggle. And it's hard to get to that place of empowerment. And so for the vast majority of people who have an adult addiction, this kind of complicated backstory around belonging, trust, and safety is there in the frame somewhere. And you could make the argument that and I'll give you some, like the next couple of slides are about other layers that build on top of this. But this is the primary layer for healing. This is what people need to heal. Nothing to do with using, right? Addiction is not about using. It's about peeling back the layers to find out what's underneath and the thing that has led to the using. It's not about substance use. So something is missing. And it's one of these four things or more of them for people who are really damaged. So the question for us becomes, how do we get people there so they can feel these things? This is what's needed. Practically speaking, how do we get there? what could we do? What kind of pathways could we find that would help people, practically speaking, move in that direction? And there's four. Of course, there's four. They build on top of the nervous system response patterns. They build on the layers that we've been talking about. The pathway to help people feel more present with themselves and with the world. The pathway of connection to other people, relationship building. The pathway of containment, containing all the emotional energy that we're dealing with and self-regulating it. And the pathway of capacity, finding a way to hold our power in the world and share it with other people and contribute something useful. So if we take each one of these in turn, it's stuff that's actually pretty simple. So for the folks who are dissociated and who might be in the world of hallucinogen use and who are just trying to get out of the world all the time and escape into fantasy reading or whatever it is, right? Physical work, embodiment, getting your hands dirty, working in the garden, being in the natural environment, exploring nature, being a citizen of the world, go travel, doing things that anchor you in the soil of life, just being present. Many people struggle with this, just being here, now. So there's a lot of research that's been done in the world of mental health, as I'm sure you know, you've heard about, that it's about stuff like, what is the mental health benefit of going for a walk in a park for 15 minutes, right? That kind of stuff. It does work. It does work very well. I should say, as I'm thinking about what works, I should say something about medications, because it always comes up and I want to preempt the question about it and just answer it in a general way. People often feel like with mental illness, mental health challenges, that the pathway is toward medication. And for some people that works great. And for some people it's a lifesaver. And for some people it sort of gets them kind of over the hard part so they can start to kind of move forward. And that's great. And if that works for you, that's great. Or anybody, that's great. There shouldn't be any stigma around that. There shouldn't be nobody should be on meds, right? Meds work for some people. They work great. The reality is they work, either sort of okay or pretty well for about 40% of people. So for more than half of the people who go on meds, they don't do anything for them or they make them worse. So we shouldn't also be stigmatizing people who are anxious about that or who feel like they want to explore other pathways. Medication is not necessarily the answer to all mental health challenges. I think it's something that if you're struggling with the mental health challenges, you might want to explore, but you shouldn't feel that if it doesn't work for you, there's something wrong with you, right? Or that, or that it's going to be the magic. Because mental health challenges, just like addictions, are not really about the behaviors. They're about where the behaviors came from and the underlying unaddressed stuff that we really should deal with. So in addition to being present in the world, connecting with people, trust and empathy and nurturing intimacy, being in like a school of fish, being with a group of people out in the world, joining communities where you do fun stuff, play music, or that's on the next slide, specific examples, but stuff like that, where you're able to build relationships that kind of move toward that sense of trust. And then on top of that, emotional safety of slowing down, experiencing the wonder of the world. Yesterday I was with a group and we were talking about the James Webb Telescope photos that have come out and the sense of tremendous awe and wonder that one can feel in response to those photographs, in response to kind of contemplating the hugeness of the universe and slowing our own minds down enough to put ourselves in context of the universe. Stuff like that, slowing down. The anxiety response person, the hypervigilant person, the stimulant user is always going so fast. Just slowing down enough that you can feel yourself. You can feel something like awe and wonder. And then for the angry folks, the alcoholics, I mean, not all alcoholics are angry, but some alcoholism is freeze response alcoholism, that kind of depression alcoholism, but a lot of it's this kind of powerlessness, angry alcoholism. So that's like building capacity for yourself to feel all these strong emotions inside of you and direct them in a way that is useful toward service or mentorship of other people or building communities or whatever, right? The fight response people are really good at wrangling people, managing people, getting stuff done, completing tasks. And so they're good at this sort of, how do we make the world a better place kind of mission. And so it's much better for them to direct it into that than into just being endlessly angry at the world, right? So these are the 4 kind of general pathways. The next one is actual, like, practical suggestions of things to try, but they kind of flow out of these considerations. These are the things we're trying to build: greater sense of presence, greater sense of connection, greater sense of containment of all that stuff that's roiling around in there, and greater capacity to be with people, to be with ourselves, and to direct our emotions in healthy ways. So if we think about all of that stuff, kind of the general place we want to arrive at in healing, if that's the destination, what are some directions? What are some possible directions for how we get there? Movement, relationship, creativity, and community. This is the kind of the top layer. This is the last of these diagrammatic slides, right? Which has 4 things where I go through each one of the 4. So, before I do this one, you'll notice, or you might have noticed, that I haven't mentioned stuff like 12-step programs yet. And that's not because they're irrelevant, but they're just kind of one method that some people find to be helpful, because people feel a sense of belonging, and they feel like they can trust people, and they can feel a sense of emotional safety to share who they are. They can feel empowered by being in a community of like-minded people. So it works for some people. But there's kind of no clinical basis in which we would say that 12-step programs are better than other methods, or smart recovery is better than 12-step, or Wellbriety, which is another method, is better than those. That's not really a thing in the addictions world, where we say, just go to a meeting and you'll be fine. It doesn't really work that way. For people who like meetings, for people who like the 12-step model, it works great and they love it, and we should support them in that. But a lot of people don't like it. A lot of people are like, I don't know. I don't like the idea of a higher power. I don't like the idea that I have to make a list of all the people I've wronged. I don't like, whatever. I don't like to hang out with people in a group like that. That's fine. So we should be clear when we talk about healthy directions, that there's no one direction that is better than others. There's no one pathway that has been shown to be effective for everybody. Everyone is different. And often it takes people quite a while to find the pathway that's going to work for them. So on the next set of columns, next 4 columns that we're going to look at on the next slide, my suggestions here are sort of, hey, you could consider this sort of thing, right? So if the addiction is around dissociation, hallucinogen, leaving the world kind of stuff, or addiction to fantasy worlds and getting out of the world, and embodiment and a sense of belonging is the pathway forward. And practically speaking, what that might look like is like movement practices. Going out, each one of these columns on this slide begins with an environment, like ocean in this case, and then an activity, typically a creative activity, and then the context, like what is it by yourself, with people, or whatever. So they're kind of programmatic in the way that all the other ones have been programmatic. So this one, being with a group of people where you do something fun. You go for a walk, you go for a hike, you join a drumming group, you learn to play a musical instrument with a group of people, you join a choir, whatever, right? These kind of practices are deeply embodying. There's a really deep sense of belonging in them. There's a sense of kind of big, connection to the wider world. That's why it's ocean. That kind of sense of vastness often comes with these experiences in these communities. Sense of connecting to everything. So movement practices have been explored pretty thoroughly in the psychological literature and in research. You probably know about the research into depression, and that's the next column, actually. So I'll do that there. So this is for the freeze response folks, building a sense of trust and relationship, being in a forest with animals, and with the sense of like the living world around us. You probably know about the research in depression, which has shown that on balance, for many people, the most effective means of recovery or or improvement for depression is running. And that, I could just spend the whole time just talking about that, because running is part of the nervous system that has this evolutionary backstory. And the fact that we stand upright, the fact that our eyes point forward, the fact that we don't have fur, the fact that we can regulate our breathing, the fact that we sweat, all these kinds of things are about running in the history of humans and the success of humans on the savannah in Africa, millions of years ago. And so the nervous system and running are really deeply entwined. And when you run, the nervous system kind of activates in particular ways to bring the nervous system into balance. It knows how to do that. It's very good at that. So that's why the running thing works for many people with depression. But, running is not the only thing, right? It's really not about the running itself. It's about what it does for the body. So in this case, it's about that sense of relationship and being with a group of people in partnership, doing something that is fulfilling and nurturing in that way. For the anxious, hypervigilant folks, the mountain environment, I was talking about rock climbing a while ago, sense of the deep story that's all around us, sense of wonder, and development of the self. I was talking a while ago about how the anxious person, the hypervigilant stimulant user, like they're always running so fast that they never slow down enough to really feel themselves and sense themselves. And so these big experiences like going into the mountains or getting involved in the big, deep story of your life or experiencing wonder, they tend to slow you down so that you can get a sense of yourself and feel something real. And so a lot of these creative practices do that. They do that very well. One of my books is about that. I wrote a book called Grain of Truth, which is about working with your hands, especially with wood. And the kind of, deep imprinting, healing kind of experiences you can get doing that. So creativity. And then for the fight response folks, community, being involved in a community of people where you can mentor and serve, and provide a sense of capacity for other people. So again, if we pull back a little bit and just look at all these, it's like, okay, there's nothing here about specific addictions programs, right? There's nothing here about 12 steps or anything else. It's like, it's bigger than that because addiction is deeper than that. It's about all the other things that are living in the background and that are enacting themselves as patterns in the background while we go through our daily lives thinking that it's just about using. And if only I could stop using, I'd be fine. No. When you stop using, all the other stuff that the using was keeping you from seeing and feeling, you suddenly feel and see. That makes you worse, makes you feel worse rather than better. So just stopping using is not the solution to this. It's important. It's useful to stop using, but it doesn't fix it. It just makes all the other stuff more visible. And then you've got to ask yourself, what am I going to do about all the other stuff? Now I realize, holy crap, underneath this, I'm really depressed, or I'm really anxious all the time, or I'm completely dissociated. I'm completely alone in my life and I have no relationships, or I'm just deeply angry about the shit that my dad did to me, whatever it is, right? Stopping using exposes the underlying mental health dynamic, which is webbed into the underlying trauma, which typically has a deep backstory going all the way back to childhood. So when we stop using, we stop drinking, all this stuff becomes available. And for most people who've had an addiction for many years, there's not only the stuff that got them into addiction, but then there's all the other stuff that went wrong when they started the addiction. And so there's this other stuff they have to deal with as well. So there's a lot of things to unpack there. And it takes a long time to do that. So when we think about recovery, when we think about how long does recovery take? Well, after you stop using, you're probably looking at a year or so just to get stable, just to get to the point where you can get up out of bed in the morning and not feel like your first impulse is to use. That takes a while. For some, it takes less time for, say, alcoholics than it takes for cocaine users. And there's complicated neurological reasons for that. The cocaine users can experience these deep cravings for a couple of years after they stop because of the way that cocaine impacts the nervous system and the brain. But it's not really important, that part. What's important is that Stopping is the first step, not the last step. It opens up the landscape to all the other stuff. And when all the other stuff comes out or becomes available for our inspection and use and personal growth, well, then we can do basic things like I'm talking about here. We can get ourselves involved in practices which lead us toward health. We could go into some counseling if that's something we want to do. We could go join a group. We could go to a 12-step thing. We could do some other kind of, sobriety thing if that's what we want. Right? There's no requirement to do that. You can get to health and wellness without joining, a specifically focused group like that. There's no one pathway. Everybody's different. But we do need to take the time. If you're an adult and you suddenly decide that you're going to stop using, you're looking at quite a bit of commitment to personal growth over the next couple of years. It's going to take a while for you to navigate through all that stuff, even for simple, so-called simple addictions like smoking. If we think about what's your risk, what's your lifetime risk for death from addiction, the highest risk is if you're a smoker, if you're a cigarette smoker. Cigarette smoking will kill 2/3 of all smokers. And there's no like one method that will work better than any other method. I used to be the clinical supervisor for BC Cancer Agency's Stop Smoking Helpline. And the counselors who manned that helpline, they were like, you know what? People are different. Everybody finds a different pathway. Most people need a bunch of tries to find the pathway that works for them. And most people who successfully quit smoking, they do it in a way that's really about emotion. They get to a place where they just feel like, you know what? I'm ready to I'm ready to move along. I'm ready to deal with the underlying stuff that the smoking kept me from dealing with. I just feel emotionally done with it because I'm wanting to think of my life in a deeper way. And I no longer want to just kind of keep escaping from it every once in a while, every few minutes. So there's lots of pathways here. Now, I'm going to switch off the slides in a moment and we're going to have our discussion period. But before we do that, just take a moment for yourself that you're not going to share with the group or with me here in this kind of more or less public space. But I've run through a lot of material here. And you'll go on with your day after we finish in 20 minutes or so. And some of it you'll remember and some of it you won't. And tomorrow you'll not remember most of it. We know a lot about state dependent learning, where when you're in a certain state, you learn something and then you move into a different state and you forget it. So this is a really personal thing. I've been really tagging a lot of personal issues here, and something might have tagged for you, and something I've said about it might be important for you. If that's the case, write it down. Like, just write it down now and ask yourself, what might I do about this? Is there something I should do? Should I think more mindfully about some unresolved family stuff? Should I think more mindfully or more deeply about some unresolved trauma? Should I think more deeply about mental illness and mental health challenges that I'm experiencing or a loved one's experiencing? Or should I think in a more nuanced way about addictions, especially if those involve alcohol and cannabis, the most common ones, or nicotine? There's something that you might do, maybe. Maybe you came to this session with a particular goal for yourself. If you did, then I'm hoping that you got some information that's useful to advance that for yourself. And if you did, you should write it down now so you don't forget it.